It is great to be with you here at Heritage and to share a few thoughts with you. You're very brave to come and listen to me. In an earlier career, I was an attorney, which is a group not always known for its brevity of speech. And for a number of years now, I've been an academic, a group not always known for its clarity of speech. And now I'm from California, coming to bring you wisdom. I won't even try to describe what that's like. But I am here today to talk about this book that was released in October, The New Deal on Modern American Conservatism, A Defining Rivalry. And I begin, I think, with this quotation from the great writer Pearl Buck, who said, "If you want to understand today, you have to search yesterday." And I think conservatives are increasingly realizing that we have to look a little further back than we have been for the roots of modern American conservatism. The conventional wisdom, I think, has been that we look to the 1950s for the birth of modern American conservatism. Russell Kirk, William F. Buckley, the founding of National Review, those are all important places to look in terms of the conservative movement. And then we have this year Amity Schleye's new book, an excellent book, I think, on Coolidge, which looks to the 1920s and to Calvin Coolidge as perhaps an author or at least an early practitioner of modern American conservatism. But in this book, we argue that the place we should be looking for the birth of modern American conservatism is in the 1930s. Because in our view, the New Deal is what really brought about modern American conservatism. The New Deal was the height, really, of the progressive movement of that era. And it was, as we describe in this book, really our French Revolution. If you know your conservative history, you know that the founder, the father, if you will, of modern conservatism more broadly is widely considered to be Edmund Burke, who is responding to the excesses of the French Revolution. In our view, the New Deal was America's French Revolution. It was a complete overturn of not only governance, but we would argue our whole fabric in this country. And we believe it is still the framework for American domestic and economic policy today, 80 years later, and unfortunately still going strong. And so responding to the New Deal has really become the project for and the reason for being for modern American conservatism. And if you go back to the 1930s, you find that the first spokesman, we won't argue necessarily that he was our Edmund Burke, but at least the prophet crying in the wilderness in the 1930s about the excesses of the New Deal was Herbert Hoover. And the Hoover-Roosevelt debates of the 1930s could really be considered the debates that we're having in America today about liberalism, progressivism on one hand, the Obama leadership, healthcare, we'll talk about that, income inequality, all of those debates that we're having today could easily have been taken from the Hoover-Roosevelt debates of the 1930s. And so in this short book, The New Deal in Modern American Conservatism, we go back to the 1930s, but with the express purpose of coming back to public policy today, searching the past to try to find sort of the path through the debates that we're having in America today, progressivism against conservatism. And we do this in three areas. We believe there are three primary topics in which the New Deal debate sort of framed what we are still debating and arguing today. And the first of these would be the debate between liberty and equality. If you know your history, you'll remember that when the French journalist de Tocqueville came to America in the 19th century, he observed that one of the primary differences between our republic and the French Revolution and Republic was their emphasis on égalité, equality, but America's emphasis in our revolution on liberté, or liberty. And one of Hoover's biggest complaints about the New Deal was that he was voluntarily turning America into a form of European totalitarianism, turning its back on liberty in order to turn toward some form of communitarianism. The New Deal was all about government planning, about central planning, about regulation, what Hoover called economic regimentation. And in fact, if we look back in the debate at that time, each of the two, Hoover and Roosevelt, had a sort of cartoon caricature, if you will, that helped them frame their argument. Hoover had his rugged individual, and Roosevelt had his forgotten man. And those were the two sort of icons of this 1930s debate. And as you look at those, you know, as Herbert Hoover argued, America had always been the land of equality of opportunity. And Roosevelt just said straight out that equality of opportunity in America is dead, quote unquote, in the 1930s. And so the New Deal became creating equality, as Hoover pointed out, not just of opportunity, but of outcome. It was about guaranteeing a better life for the forgotten man or for every man. And of course, this is exactly the debate we're having today. When Obama keeps trotting out his message about income inequality, clearly a form of equality of outcomes, this is exactly what we are debating today. And I'm sure you've all rushed to see the new documentary by Robert Reich about income inequality. I mean, this is what progressives are basically trying to press for today, is to make a case for higher taxation of the rich and for a higher minimum wage and a variety of tools that they would like to deploy because of income inequality. And so as we point out in our book, this is exactly what Hoover and Roosevelt were debating in the 30s. And frankly, we don't think conservatives are doing a great job about the income inequality debate. And in ways that we can't take time in this very brief session, the data are not entirely supportive of this presumption, this new conventional wisdom that has been born. In fact, we argue that one of the ways you change public policy is you first have a new conventional wisdom. And that's where Obama is starting, and Robert Reich and others. Let's have a conventional wisdom understanding that income inequality is the big problem in this economy. The data are not entirely supportive of that, but more than that, it asks the wrong question. Income inequality is not the right question. The question in an equality of opportunity society like ours is income mobility. Can people move up and down the income scale? Now, unfortunately, these huge studies of income in America lag by a few years. But both of the last two large studies that have been done on income mobility verify that there is still a great deal of movement among income ranks in this country. And again, we point these out in our book. In one study, two different studies of the 96 to 05 time frame, half of the taxpayers changed quintiles, income quintiles during this period of time. Half moved up from the bottom quintile of income to one of the higher quintiles. Interestingly, a quarter of the people in the top income quintile, these people who are rich and who we need to punish and tax, a quarter of them dropped from the top into lower income quintiles. So the mobility of income moves in both directions. It moves down as well as up. And so really that's the question to ask in an equality of opportunity society is, do people still have an opportunity to move up and down the income scale? That's the right question. And we quote favorably this wonderful little book by Nicholas Eberstadt last year about economic dependency. The real problem, as Herbert Hoover would have argued it, with trying to use government as a tool for income equality is we then create people who are dependent on government. And this was Hoover's big fear, that by taking away people's liberty, we would end up making them dependent on government. And this is precisely the point of this excellent little book by Eberstadt, that Mitt Romney's famous, if inartfully timed, message in the election about the 47% or more who are dependent upon the government, it turns out those figures are essentially right, that we're closer now to 49% who are receiving some form of government payment. And Hoover's concern was about what happens to the spirit and the will of the people when that happens. And so this is the first area where, as I said, it seems to us that the debates today about income inequality are precisely the arguments that were had in the 1930s. And indeed, we think one of the failures of conservatives today is to carry forward this liberty agenda that Herbert Hoover put forward very effectively. In our view, let me see if I have my picture of this. In our view, what progressives would like to do is to turn the Liberty Bell into the Equality Bell. I should have had a picture here of the Heritage Bell, shouldn't I? I have it right behind me. And you know, it's really interesting. I'll just add, this is not in our book because it's happening today, this week. But this debate is happening right now. The American people are just now figuring out that under Obamacare, they no longer have the liberty to keep their own individual plans. You see, the way healthcare has worked in the past is that you had room for both the rugged individual and the forgotten man. The rugged individual would have his or her own health insurance through their job, through their workplace, through some other means, so they were taken care of. And you created a safety net for people who couldn't have that. That was for the forgotten man, and those two things sort of work together. But now what Obamacare has done is it has taken over the whole program. And the American people are just waking up. You know, to most American people, especially young people, liberty is an abstraction. They don't really understand, you know, they've grown up with big government. They don't really understand why liberty is important to them personally. Well, now they're seeing it, because now they don't have the liberty to have their own health plan, their own rugged individual plan, and they're angry about that. And they should be, because it wasn't necessary to solve the problem for the relatively small percentage of people who did not have health insurance by taking over the whole system. And so we see here, I think, a very clear case of where the American people, if they understand the value of liberty, if it's not just an abstraction to them, but if they really understand it, it could make a difference to the future of conservatism. Second point that we make is that limited government and big government was essentially the second big topic of this time frame. Limited government was part of the case for America from the founding. I have here this wonderful quotation from Thomas Jefferson when the Declaration of Independence issued its complaints about King George III. Among them was, "He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance." And that pretty well describes, I think, where we are today. We have created offices of people who are eating out our substance. And this has there have historically been a couple of ways to look at big government versus limited government. One we call in our book the quantitative way, and the other is the qualitative way. The quantitative way, there are lots of measures of it. How many employees, particularly how many civilian employees do you have in the federal government? Of course, it's at an all-time high today. The amount of pages in the federal regulations, of course, it's at an all-time high today. The classic quantitative way to look at it is the percent of GDP, gross domestic product, being spent on government. And of course, we know that once again, during this current Obama era, that once again, that figure is at a near all-time high. And once the baby boomers, my generation, are fully entitled, if you will, that number is projected to grow enormously. And so the quantitative numbers in terms of big government look pretty bad. But on the qualitative side, and this I think is where Herbert Hoover made such a good case and where we think American conservatives need to make a stronger case, big government versus limited government is also a qualitative question. It's also a question of how much of our lives are being taken over and run by government. Are there new areas of our lives that government has been taking over? Do we have increased dependency on government and a reduction in individual liberty and initiative? Those kind of qualitative questions, not just about big government in numbers, but about big government versus limited government, maybe the better phrase for conservatives than small government. Not sure we're going to get to small government, quote unquote. Maybe we should talk more about limited government, not only in the quantitative terms, but also qualitative, a government that is less involved in our individual lives. And here I think the record is equally scary if we could somehow draw a chart. You take K through 12 education, for example. What's a more classic example of a state and local issue historically in America than K through 12 education? And yet educators would tell you today that perhaps the primary player in education reform and in educational initiatives, policy initiatives, is now the federal government. starting with No Child Left Behind during a Republican administration, continuing with Race to the Top during a Democratic administration. These kinds of issues continue to grow, where Washington wants to take over more and more of our lives and what we do. Healthcare is certainly another example. There's nothing in the Constitution empowering the federal government to deal with healthcare. Health and welfare has always been considered to be a matter for the states. But Washington has this habit of finding a major problem, declaring war on it, moving into a wartime footing, and that's language right out of Roosevelt. When Roosevelt started his New Deal, he said, if I can't get all this done, I will ask for the one power that a president needs to have, the power to declare war on this economic crisis that we face. And so Washington likes to declare war on poverty and war on illiteracy and war on drugs. Why do they do that? Well, mostly so they have a reason for the federal government to amass the troops, if you will, to take on that battle. And so we see the federal government moving into more and more areas. And so limited government, we really think, is the case that conservatives ought to make, both for quantitative reasons, this chart that you have before you, but also for the qualitative reasons, for the areas of our lives and a policy that government is inclined to run. And then the third topic we take up is constitutionalism. And here we point to two classic speeches. Hoover and Roosevelt both gave speeches on Constitution Day, a year or two apart. And the difference between their two speeches is really quite remarkable. Roosevelt's speech starts with the beginning words of the Constitution are, "We the people." And because the Constitution is for we the people can do whatever we want about the Constitution. And so if we need changes in our government, if we need changes in our Constitution, we the people can do that, because the document was by us and it is for us, and we're free to do what we want. Of course, ignoring the fact that constitutional amendments were the way the Constitution said we the people should act. And by the way, one of the ironies is that FDR accomplished this huge revolution of the New Deal with no constitutional amendments, if you go back and look at the history. The only constitutional amendment in that time frame is to limit the president to 2 terms after Roosevelt's lengthy presidency. No other constitutional amendments, because he did it all through reinterpretation, if you will, or his failed attempt to pack the court and get the court to go along with his approach. Hoover, by contrast, gave a very different speech. His speech started with the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And he said one of the primary values of a Constitution is to protect the people from their own government, a very different starting point than we, the people, in FDR's speech. And then the rest of Hoover's speech is really about our system of federalism and how important our system of federalism is, that we have checks and balances, that we have balances of power within the government, all of this to make the republic work as it should. And so, of course, it's easy to trace this continuing battle today. We have today this very same we the people versus the federalism and the Constitution protecting people from their own government. We have this debate continuing today. We have the living Constitution folks who would like to make wholesale changes to the Constitution, who find the constitutional processes of federalism anachronistic, out of touch with the modern needs of the country, inhibiting Congress from doing what needs to be done and addressing the big issues of the day, versus originalism, which was the reason we have a federal republic is because we and the founders all should be nervous about democracy. We should all be nervous about people deciding to take away our rights, the government taking away our rights, and the Constitution is meant to be a sort of an ageless, timeless protection against that. And the balances of power and the checks and balances are to sort of keep government in check, as opposed to trimming all of that away so that we, the people, through our government, can do what needs to be done. So again, these debates of the 1930s very much previewing the debates today. And then the last chapter of our book is the future of conservatism, and that's fairly widely available on the internet today. But I'll start by saying that the two authors of this book, Gordon Lloyd and I, are very good friends. Gordon is a professor at Pepperdine, where I was for 25 years. And Gordon and I have written a number of columns and things together over the years. We had very different reactions to the 2012 election as conservatives. One of us felt like this was a no country for old men moment. I don't know if you saw that movie or read that book, but one of us felt like Tommy Lee Jones, the sheriff, where the weaponry and the drug money and all of that had really changed the nature of policing in rural Texas. And he felt powerless, really, to take on the nature of crime, and it sort of as well, I just think I need to retire and turn this over to somebody else. I can't handle this anymore. Well, one of us had that reaction to the election, looking at perhaps a new majority coalition of young people, of people who are heavily dependent on government, of more liberal business people, that perhaps a new coalition had arrived, and this is a moment where what can conservatives really do against this kind of new majority? The other author had more, if we have to stay in the Hollywood movie vein, had more of a Mr. Smith Goes to Washington moment. He feels that he's making a big difference teaching the Constitution and the principles of democracy to students and to others, and the American people, he argues, are center right, and sure, they may get carried away in this or that election, but as former British Prime Minister Harold Wilson said, a week in politics is a long time. Let's not give up based on the outcome of a single election. And so what we do in the last chapter of this book is we go on to say, it seems to us that conservatives really need to ask themselves some really hard questions if they want to really have an impact in the 21st century. And I just list two of them here. We have 4 or 5 of them in the last chapter of the book. Question 1, does liberty still resonate? For Edmund Burke, the essence of conservatism was liberty. And Herbert Hoover described his whole campaign against the New Deal as the challenge to liberty. And historically, that's what conservatism has been about. It has been about defending economic, political, and religious liberty in all of its places. But the question that we need to ask is, does that message still resonate today? Do young people, for example, really resonate with the question of liberty? And one of our fears, we both have been involved in teaching for most of our careers, so we work with young people all the time. One of our concerns is that, as I mentioned briefly a moment ago, for many people, liberty has become an abstraction. It's not something that's real to them. There was a poll taken by the Pew Foundation about a year ago, and the question was, do you think we need more government to solve our problems today? And all the generations, except one, said, no, we don't. But the generation 30 and under said, yes, we could use more government to solve our problems. Well, they've grown up with big government. That's really all they've known. And so to them, the notion that government is something potentially to fear and was potentially a challenge to their liberty doesn't seem to really be a gut-level issue for them. And so it seems like we have to find opportunities as conservatives to take liberty out of the abstraction area and help it be more real. When my wife told me that not only could I not pick the shower head that I wanted for my bathroom, but in California, or the county we live in or whatever, I couldn't even have the handles to the shower head that I wanted. That was a moment when I said, okay, I'm too heavily regulated, if I can't pick my own shower. That was a not abstract but real liberty moment for me. When one of my children just got his first full-time job, which is not easy, as many of you know these days. And he's doing the math, and he's realizing that he's going to be working till April, or in some places early May, for the government, essentially. I mean, maybe liberty is not such an abstraction to him in a moment like that. I mentioned earlier, I think part of Americans awakening to the fact that they can't have their own health insurance that they worked for and paid for, but they can't even own it anymore. It's illegal to have that policy. I think that's a potential liberty moment where, again, liberty can become real. or when the mayor of New York wants to tell you what size of soda you can and cannot drink. So I think we have to find these moments when liberty is not just an abstraction, and I think part of the message is that liberty has to be more real to people, because that has always been the heart of conservatism. A second question we ask is it time to give up on values? You hear a lot of people saying, well, really the heart of conservatism ought to be fiscal conservatism, or maybe national security conservatism, but that we've made a mistake going down this values road, this whole social right, the Christian right, and perhaps we need to move away from that. And certainly in California, we have lots of Republicans, and they would probably even call themselves conservatives, who are fiscally, economically conservative, but would be socially moderate and perhaps even liberal. So we deal with this a great deal in California. But though I'm not personally, I think, a social, I am religious, but I'm not from the religious right. I'm probably not even a strong social conservative, actually, as opposed to more libertarian in some of those ways. But I would acknowledge, and I think conservatism has to acknowledge, it has always had a values-based component. Edmund Burke talked about the need for a manly, regulated liberty. The founders of America all talked about the fact that we had to have, in order to have a free republic, you have to have a virtuous people. And where do you find those virtues? What are the sources of virtue that would allow a free republic to work in the way that this one does? So it seems to us, as we kind of fight through this, that it's probably not right for conservatives to give up on values. We may need to find a broader set of values that we can live with, that's maybe a little less narrow and specific on each and every issue. We maybe need to remember principles of federalism ourselves and not go all the way to the Supreme Court or shut down the government or whatever it may be every time we think our principles are being violated. That's probably not an entirely conservative means of operating. But to give up on values altogether probably is not the best way for conservatives to go. So we try to suggest some ways to deal with the values questions, short of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So in conclusion, I think of the story of the husband and the wife who were chatting, and the husband said, I just have to ask you this. If I lost everything, if I lost the house, if I lost the car, if I lost the boat, would you still love me? And she said, yes, honey, I would still love you. I would miss you, but I would still love you. So after 80 years, conservatism is still in the fight. 80 years after the New Deal. It's not gone. It's not missing from the equation. The New Deal is still there after 80 years and going strong. I guess that's the bad news from my point of view. But modern American conservatism is still there also, kind of engaged in the battle for liberty, the battle for values, the battle for the Constitution. It's still in the battle. Wilmore Kendall, Oklahoma political philosopher who I like very much, says the American people are center-right in their hips. I like that, center-right in their hips. And it seems to me if those of us thinkers about conservatism and political actors about conservatism, if we could just give something to their heads and in their heart to kind of join with their hips, that there is hope for conservatism. And so at Hoover, and I know at Heritage, that's what we're working on, is some ideas for the head and some concepts for the heart that would kind of match up with this center-right feeling that Kendall sees in the Americans' hips. So we close on a note of optimism. I'm not ready to resign yet as sheriff, though I considered it for a time. I was the No Country for Old Men one. But we invite you to take up a copy of it, particularly Chapter 5. I think if you, though the book is not terribly long, as my wife said when I brought home the first copy after all the work, she looked at the thin volume and said, all that work for this? So the whole thing wouldn't take you too long, but Chapter 5 in particular, I think, kind of looks at conservatism toward the future. So that's a quick summation of what we've done in this piece, and I'm happy to open the floor. I think we've saved a reasonable amount of time for questions, comments. I would say if you have a comment, don't feel you have to frame it as a question, but keep it relatively brief. I don't know how, do you want me to just call on folks?
Why don't you just do it?
All right, here we go. I guess we're going to wait for microphone. So.
conservatives still disappointed that Eisenhower didn't seize the opportunity to roll back the New Deal and just was comfortable with it. Perhaps his whole life being in the military, i.e., an employee of the government, helped him make that decision.
Right.
But a lot of people, I think, were along with Eisenhower at that time because I think this was still a fairly new experiment. I mean, communism was a new experiment, which a lot of people thought was going to beat the West, as we all know. It's a lot of water under the bridge now. I think we've seen the failure of socialist, communist society after another. We've seen the failure of our own social systems or the impending failure of them. I do think it is time now that a lot of Americans can believe our message. I think we have history on our side. I think I'm more optimistic now than I would have been in 1950. What do you take on that?
Well, as I said, of the two co-authors, I'm the more pessimistic. So I really, in fairness, should have my colleague Gordon Lloyd here, who's a little more optimistic. But even in Herbert Hoover, there is a bit of that tension. And so Hoover, as Secretary of Commerce and President, say in the 1920s to 1932, was willing to abide a bit more progressivism. And in fact, didn't mean to give a commercial for this, but another book came out this week called Toward an American Conservatism, Conservatism During the Progressive Era. And Gordon and I also wrote the chapter in that book about Herbert Hoover, and we write about that period of time. And of course, it depends on the time. The post-war World War II era with Ike was quite different in America, just as Hoover's time in the 1920s and Coolidge's was quite different. And you're recovering from the war, it's sort of a different, investing in America is sort of a different time. But then when Hoover saw the New Deal, it sort of shocked him into a very different form of conservatism. And I think that's what we're seeing today, personally. I think there are times, again, post-war recovery, the economy's doing well, Americans maybe abide a bit more progressivism. But then you have these, what we call in our book Burkean moments, where going along with the conventional wisdom really no longer makes sense, but sort of taking a stand seems to be more the way. And I guess the sign of optimism, I can't believe that 3 years after signing the Affordable Health Care Act, we're still debating it in this country. I take that as a very encouraging sign that when the biggest piece of entitlement legislation since Medicare, Medicaid in the 1960s is still being debated and opposed 3 years after signed into law, that's a positive sign, it seems to me. So even I'm trying to work up some more optimism for the time that we're living in. Yes, sir.
Hi, I don't know if your book addresses it. I noticed in the article. Can you comment on what I see as the conservative movement relentlessly self-cleansing itself for purity versus certainly the left, which doesn't seem to, they'll accept a different viewpoint on an issue as long as, so there's Chris Christie comes to mind, but there's others where, if every issue isn't perfect, he's not conservative enough. And that seems to be a big issue.
Let me say first that we wrote this book for conservatism as a political philosophy, and we don't consider it an inherently political book in the sense that we think there have been plenty of Republicans who haven't followed the conservative principles that we argue in favor of, and of course, lots more Democrats. So getting into the giving of political advice is either above or arguably below my pay grade. Having said that, I'm a bit more of the view that Ronald Reagan said it well. If somebody agrees with you 80% of the time, you don't necessarily go to war over the 20%. You try to move forward on the 80% that you can agree upon. And I agree with you that conservatives have had a tendency to be sort of purists and to find the 20% or sometimes even less than that we can argue about. But I also have sort of a pendular view of history that, things have to swing away for a while. And then I think eventually Republicans and conservatives become so frustrated they know they have to win. And so they have to become, I think, a little less eating their young and more willing to look for that 80%. So I tend to be more of that school of thought. But I work in a think tank on purpose, not in a political tank. So I'm not the expert on political tactics necessarily.
Hi, this is Paul Jossi. Thank you for this talk. One of the other people in his own capacity, or one of the other few people that were arguing against the New Deal was George Sutherland and the other four horsemen. And I was just wondering if you could comment on your view of what I think was an abandonment with Robert Bork and some of the other people to the individual liberties that they were fighting for in the 1930s, and much more of a deference to legislative acts and sort of an acceptance of the New Deal and the rise of the administrative state that came after it, and sort of and you see this with Chevron deference, and you see this over and over, I think, with modern conservatives in the judicial movement of not an unwillingness to enforce enumerated powers. And I just wondered if you could comment on that.
No, I mean, I sounds like I would be closer to your view than not. As it happens at the Hoover Institution, I occupy the former office of Milton Friedman, which creates certain pressures, I suppose. Although when I said to a friend when I was first moving there, I said, I have Milton Friedman's old office. And he said, well, do you know how short the furniture is? Oops. Milton Friedman famously said that businessmen, just to pick one group that sometimes temporizes in my view, businessmen, Friedman said, are for free market principles, except for the occasional, and I forgot how he put it, for the occasional special help or something in their own line of work, and they're all in Washington lobbying all the time, even though in theory we're for free markets. But in our particular business, we just need a little accommodation here, or we need a little extra regulation there. And I think Friedman sort of nailed it in that sense. I mean, we all have our broad principles, but sometimes when we get down into narrow areas, we'll abide more government intervention. This is a problem that I have about federalism, to your point about courts in general. Gordon and I have written, Is There Anything Left of Federalism? We wrote a piece a few years ago by that title. And we concluded that federalism has essentially become the policy or the philosophy of whatever party is out of power. In other words, Republicans or Democrats, if they're in Washington, they're going to regulate. They're gonna do stuff that I don't want government doing. And whoever's out of power then says, well, I'm for federalism. I think we want that power devolving to state, local, or even to the individual. So there is something about, as Milton Friedman said, when your own interest is at stake, or there's something about if you are the person in power, you think you can see things better than others. This is one thing I like, if I could do a little riff on Coolidge for a minute. This is one thing I like about Coolidge very much, is he was very principled about his principles and was not easily moved by other kinds of arguments. Amity Shlaes, I think, nicely calls him the great refrainer. Now, I have reasons to think that Coolidge is not necessarily the best model for modern American conservatism. We can get into that if you want to. But I like the great refrainer, and I think this is a problem for conservatives. There's really no constituency, or not much of a constituency, for real federalism, for example, real refraining. And that's where I would be. So I'm with you on that.
It seems to me that if you look at foreign policy, FDR is the conservative, and Hoover went a bit off the deep end. What do you think about that?
Well, the whole tariff thing is a real problem. That's for sure. We are writing here about the post-presidential Hoover. And that's really what our book is about. How Hoover in his post-presidency engaged the New Deal after he was sort of, as they say of conservatives generally, mugged by the reality of the New Deal. But I would agree with you. Now, there is an interesting book, George Nash, who is the best known and most prolific of the Herbert Hoover biographers and scholars, has released one book in the last year and is releasing another book next month, literally. These are two books that he found in the Hoover Institution archives that the chief, as he's referred to, Herbert Hoover, had written but had never been published. And one was about America's place in the world, this larger set of questions. I think clearly tariffs are a place where Hoover and Coolidge and his colleagues were off the reservation. I guess it's hard to get everything right, but that's a pretty big thing, I think, to get wrong. On other things, and I have to be honest with you, I've read Nash's 100-page introduction to the book, but not the other 900 pages that follow. But from the 100-page introduction I've read, it seems like Hoover was more conservative and in line in a national security sense than I had understood before. So that might be worth looking at. But certainly on tariffs, you're right. I mean, I think that. But the whole Republican Party was, in a sense, missing that boat, I think, in that time frame.
Freedom of trade.
Yes, Freedom to be Trade is the name of the Nash book that I'm mentioning. So, but as I said, we're not really taking that one on. Any more comments, questions? Okay.
When was the last conservative government that we've had? I know it's been said about 2000 through 2006 that the Republicans had, quote unquote, complete control. But I know that in looking that up, they only had an average of 52 in the Senate. And also, according to the NTU ratings, which are the best ratings on economics, about 7 of those were not fiscally conservative.
Right. Well, obviously, it depends on how you define conservative. When you look at this chart that I showed of GDP, size of government expenditure to GDP, there are really only 2 hopeful periods since World War II. One of the 2 Clinton administrations and one of the 2 Reagan administrations. And neither of those was really a drastic reduction. It was more in the nature of a slowing of the rate of increase. And in fairness, I sort of hate to say this, but obviously that calculation of GDP, government expenditure to GDP, also depends a lot on how GDP is doing at that time. So if you have a booming economy, as Reagan did in one term and as Clinton did in certainly one term, then if the GDP is bigger, then even bigger government growth gets absorbed in that by comparison. So if you want to go just fiscally, one Clinton term and one Reagan term are the only 2 where you find any reduction or slow in the rate of increase. So that's why both Peter Berkowitz, who's a Hoover fellow who has I think a good book, short book. Hoover Institution is into short books these days. Peter Berkowitz has a good short book called Constitutional Conservatism, in which he makes the same argument we do, in effect, that it might be time to for conservatives to quit talking about smaller government, size per se, and talk about limited government, because, frankly, government to trim government size and just may be an argument that's going to be hard to win or to carry out. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for sharing your insights with us and for taking us back to some first principles of who we are, where we've come from, and what we stand for. Appreciate it. Thanks to you and Gordon for your wonderful book. We look forward to it and to the new chapter you have in Palgrave's newly released. What's the name of the new book?
Well, I should say 2 things. The title of it is Toward an American Conservatism, and the price tag at Amazon is $86. Even I have not purchased one. And you'll notice Hoover was not giving those away here today.
Yes. Okay. On that note, we stand adjourned. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.